Developers of the Division 2, leadership of the Division franchise at large, we need your help. Specifically, the PvP player base and community needs your help. Now, I know just the utterance of the word PvP will cause many people watching to gasp, shudder, and recoil. There's no question that PvP is a divisive topic and brings with it a lot of baggage from the Division's history. I'm not here to try and pretend that that's not the case. But at the same time, whenever PvP is discussed, I try and remind people that although it is easy to pretend that every single PvP player out there is ultra toxic and out to ruin everybody's day, there are so many more who simply enjoy the challenge of player versus player combat, who enjoy coming up with inventive and strong builds to pit against other agents, who enjoy the intensity and asymmetric fights that the Deadzone offers. My favorite content within this franchise, and the reason I got hooked on the Division all the way back in 2016, was PvP, and I'm making this video today because my favorite mode of content within the game is hurting, and it needs some love. Some things I'd like to clarify, however, this video is not just going to be a rant about how appalling it is that PvP has been neglected for so long. Does it suck that it's received very little content or support for years on end now? Yes, without question. But it's not like that happened for no reason. I can make an entire video on its own going into Red Storm's involvement with the franchise, their departure, the lack of resources since then, and how that's impacted content prioritization. But frankly, that all doesn't matter. We're at where we're at, and nothing will change what has gotten us to this point. Now, some may ask, likely those who don't care much for PvP to begin with, why bother with all of this, or with PvP altogether? It's the lesser played side of the game compared to PvE, and we barely get enough content as it is for the game as a whole. Those are fair points. However, I would ask you to consider this. As much as some don't care to acknowledge it, PvP has been part of the Division's identity since the day it was revealed back in 2013, and while yes, it has always been secondary to the PvE core of the game, you cannot ignore that the Division 1's Deadzone is a big part of what defined that game and drew in so much mainstream attention. It's perhaps even more astounding that all these years later, in 2025, for a game that nowadays caters to a predominantly PvE audience, Deadzone and PvP content are among some of the most viewed and popular videos on my channel in recent times. My point is this: having a sound and functional PvP side to the game does nothing but bolster the franchise's overall player count and drives longevity through endgame content that requires far less frequent content development and drops. The reason I make this video is that unfortunately, the Division 2's current PvP presentation is rather unsound and at times hardly functional. Now, I'm not coming on here to ask that huge amounts of resources be siphoned away from PvE content development in order to prop up PvP, but what I want to try and articulate and amplify today is how a vast number of PvP players have been voicing very serious concerns about the very framework of PvP content within the game, and how, unfortunately, very little has been done to address it. I didn't choose just any random time to make this video, either. Recently, we learned that a successor to the infamous PvPvE survival mode from the Division 1 is making its way to the Division 2 with survivors, and while not confirmed yet, it's all but a given that this will include at least the option to opt into PvP combat. That's notable because this will be the first quote-unquote new PvP content that this game has had in years, and while that is very exciting for someone like myself who has loved PvP since day one, it's rather hard to imagine it actually releasing into the Division 2's current PvP environment, where, for example, cheating has skyrocketed in the recent months, that being just one of the topics that I want to address within this video. So, for the sake of the more than you'd think PvP players out there who simply want to enjoy their time in that corner of the game, for the sake of faithfully supporting this content that already exists within the game that you offer and market to newcomers, and for the sake of repairing what's broken ahead of this next big chapter for the game arriving, I kindly ask that you please give me a few minutes of your time as I walk through what I believe to be the most critical top-line concerns of the PvP community. We begin with features. Now, there are an endless number of new features that PvP players would love to see come to the Division 2. More Deadzone events like the subway contamination we got in the Division 1, conflict improvements like more mode offerings or private matches, the list goes on. However, to me and many others, there's one feature that rises above the rest in terms of its significance for restoring some order and balance to PvP combat itself, and that is expertise levels. As they stand, expertise levels within PvP not only create create a major power divide between veteran and beginner players, much more so than the usual gap created by optimized versus unoptimized builds, but they also simply skew time to kill in what I believe to be a highly unhealthy way. Now, back with Project Resolve in early 2024, the last time that we saw any real significant changes made to PvP, expertise along with shade levels were actually removed from conflict. And since then, I went from a player who would spend 80% of his time PvPing in the Dark Zone and only 20% in conflict, compared to nowadays, where I spend 80% in conflict and only 20% in the DZ. And that simply comes down to the fact, while it is still flawed for many other reasons, PvP combat itself feels much better, in my view, without the presence of expertise levels. As noted prior, expertise levels, given their grind requirements, create a major power gap within PvP, and if the Division 2 ever wants to foster growth within PvP content and promote it as an endgame feature for players to try, you can't then have it structured where dozens of hours of grinding is required on top of crafting an optimal build simply in order to compete stats-wise. The introduction of shade level brackets to the Dark Zones in recent updates certainly helped as new players get a bit of a reprieve, but as soon as they cross that SHD 1000 mark, which is quite achievable these days with the frequent XP events that run, they're then shoved into lobbies with players who have upwards of 30% greater damage than them, no matter how good their build may be. And that's simply not fun, nor fair. As mentioned, there's also the implicit time to kill impact that expertise has. Reason being, despite both weaponry and armor being eligible to be upgraded to expertise level 30, 1% bonus damage on a weapon versus 1% bonus armor on a gear piece do not equate. Because expertise armor bonuses only apply to base armor and not total armor, this means that a fight happening between two fully expertise 30 players results in a faster TTK than it would with those same two players using the same two builds, just without expertise bonuses. And in a sandbox where we have builds that can already delete players in the blink of an eye, this unbalance unfortunately exacerbates the other build-based problems PvP faces at the moment. Previously, the devs have explained that their reasoning for retaining expertise bonuses within the DZ is that the Dark Zone is meant to be an expression of your total power and playtime on your account. And while I respect that sentiment and agree with it in theory, the way expertise is structured and calculated as of right now, it simply cannot persist if the goal is to create a smoother and more fair PvP experience. This takes us to the next topic, balancing. Now, this is a tricky one, and before I say anything further, let me acknowledge that I understand how difficult trying to balance PvP within a game that shares its loot, stats, and talent bonuses between PvP and PvE sandboxes. Even games that have dedicated PvP support teams often struggle to get it right, so I understand the challenge it poses. That said, what I believe Division 2 PvP's biggest problem is when it comes to balancing is stagnation. Even if perfect equilibrium cannot be achieved, PvP metas usually benefit from regular shakeups to keep things fresh. If you've got one or a few build types that are clearly rising above the rest and proving to be problematic for build diversity and TTK, you do some adjustments and tweaks to try and curb them. The problem in our case is that simply doesn't happen. Some of the most prominent PvP loadouts, and the ones that often prove to be the hardest to counter in gameplay, Bighorn armor regen builds, melee bonk builds, status effect builds, mortar turret builds, capacitor umbra builds, these same loadouts that were greatly overpowered a year ago still are today, and that's just not very fun. Now, if there's one thing that I picked up on in my years of passively learning about game development, much of that from observing and participating within the Division community itself, it's that things are never as easy to do as you think they would be. So, when us players say just balance the game, I recognize that I have no idea how much effort or hours actually go into contemplating, implementing, and testing balancing changes. That said, Massive, Bucharest, whomever it may be, please balance PvP. Despite no changes on the surface being made to PvP for well over a year, as I mentioned, the quality of the moment-to-moment PvP gameplay has noticeably degraded within that time frame, largely because we continually get new gear, new exotics, and new stat possibilities added to the PvP sandbox, seemingly without much consideration for how it may be paired with what exists already. Armor regen builds, which were already nearly invincible a year ago, being able to reach 2 million, maybe 2.1 million armor, nowadays those can hit 2.5, million, and that becomes incredibly hard to deal with when that player can effectively strafe and also still deal out considerable damage with something like the Bighorn. On the other end of the spectrum, as if 6 red glass cannon builds weren't lethal enough already, the recent introduction of the Tinkerer exotic mask has skewed PvP balance altogether, now allowing for shotguns to one-shot even the highest armor-tiered builds. You can put enemies down in just a handful of shots at range with an AR. The dials just keep getting increased, with seemingly no recourse for players other than to lean into the insanity themselves. And that has turned Division PvP into a game of brute stats and strength, instead of a game of build creativity and player skill that it used to thrive on. So, even if nothing else that's on the table is able to be committed to PvP at this time, it would be more appreciated than to simply try and do a few more balancing changes each new season. And for those ready to type up a storm about how PvP balancing always comes in and ruins PvE, it doesn't have to be that way. The game already has built-in PvP and PvE talent differentiators. Make it so that in PvP, the Tinkerer causes you to take an overall hit on damage when in use, so that its viability leans more into what creative mechanical achievements you can possibly find by mixing talents over just achieving ungodly damage numbers. There's plenty of older exotics that still dominate the meta too. Make it so that the Iron Lung builds its stacks upon hit markers rather than just firing. Make it so that we're able to build into hazard protection in order to counteract pestilence stacks. It's a tall order, I know, and a lot of the time simply getting PvP players to agree on what balancing changes they actually want to see can be the greatest challenge, but I promise starting somewhere and doing something is going to leave us much better off than continuing to allow the meta to stagnate. The final point I then wish to address is the subject of cheating. Now, once again, I want to preface this by saying that in no way do I believe that curbing cheating across the board is an easy feat to accomplish. There are much larger, more prominent PvP titles than the Division 2, many that have their own dedicated anti-cheat systems that still run into widespread cheating problems. It is something that's continually evolving within the gaming industry, and those who create, promote, and use cheats are constantly updating their strategies to try and avoid detection. That all being said, it cannot be understated enough that we have a big cheating problem within the game at the moment. And as mentioned earlier on, this is one of my biggest concerns when it comes to the game's future plans with the release of Survivors. Because I don't know what has changed in the past 12 months to allow this, but the volume of posts I get tagged on in social media highlighting cheaters has gone through the roof. It seems that there are more of them than ever, with fewer sanctions being dealt than ever. And even on console, which historically features far less cheating, I've seen an unquestionable rise in lag switching, third-party plugin usage like Cronus and Zim, and it's just really tragic to see as it simply undermines the integrity and the fun of the PvP experience. And it leaves the chances for success of any new content including PvP, notably Survivors, in jeopardy if cheaters are simply going to flood in and ruin people's gameplay. Now, while the core issue of course falls back on anti-cheat software and detection, I also think that a major problem here is the reporting pipeline and communication. As the developers have told us time and time again, they apparently have no jurisdiction when it comes to dealing out sanctions to cheaters. As part of the Ubisoft umbrella, that power falls upon Ubisoft support, meaning that in order to adequately report a cheater, you can't just report them in-game or even send a video with evidence to the devs on social media. You have to navigate to Ubisoft support, sign in, and then draft out and send a ticket. Now, in a perfect world, maybe there's a way in which that works out, but when you have the chance of receiving messages like this back from them, and no, this is not a joke, this was a real response that was given to a cheating report ticket, then we have a major pipeline issue here. Again, I unfortunately do not have the answer. This is a complex issue, but at the very least, whatever steps may be available to be taken in order to streamline the reporting process and improve the ability the team has to take action on those who are blatantly cheating within the game and are well documented in doing so, that has to be a top priority. And then beyond that, while again not an easy fix, I know, some kind of improvements need to be made to the automated detection and prevention systems that are in charge of trying to keep this stuff out to begin with. Invest in technology to detect third-party usage on consoles. Perhaps try and find ways to allow for PC cheat detection at a deeper level. Because at the end of the day, regardless of what other efforts may be made to make PvP itself more fun, that all becomes meaningless if players can't actually appreciate those efforts. All thanks to those who choose the low road and spend their time ruining the experience for everybody else. Alright. Well, I believe that is all I have to say on the matter of PvP for now. Believe me, there is a lot more I would love to see in terms of PvP improving and evolving, but we have to keep things realistic, and before that could ever happen, we have to shore up and fix what we have now before even thinking about adding on top of it. I know resources have been tight these past many years, and that has been a major contributor to PvP sidelining, but just this season we saw the game reach its highest player counts since 2020. We've got DLC revenue flowing in. We've got new resources being committed, with franchise veteran Magnus Jansen returning to helm the development on Survivors. It seems like, after all this time, things may be picking up again for the division, and while I don't expect that to suddenly mean a night or day difference on PvP support or changes, again, I just hope that it isn't entirely left in the dust either. PvP is core to what makes the division the division. It holds a very special place in my heart as a fan, so let's hope that we might see some improvements down the road. Who knows? To any who made it through this video in its entirety, or who gave any of this a listen at all, thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and until I see you next, RogueGold out.